You are tuned in to the FowlWeather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
Today we are joined by Walt Rhodes, inventor of ShotSweeper. After the hunt, make the next bite safer. An innovative tool with a strong magnet that detects non-toxic shot in meat. From growing up on the Chesapeake to where Walt is today, and all the great details about the birth and development of ShotSweeper. Everyone's been there. Don't make another trip to the dentist after your next duck dinner. Listen in today to find out more. Plus, our migration forecast at the end of it all, today on the FowlWeather Podcast. Welcome, Walt, to the FowlWeather Podcast.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here and good talking to you again.
You're a long ways away on the West Coast, I think, right now, aren't you, sir? Whereabouts are you?
I'm sitting in Bend, Oregon right now.
Man, Bend, Oregon. So I got a good story about Bend, Oregon. My wife and I flew out to Washington State, then drove down through Oregon, California. I got a massive tooth infection while we were trying to go see the redwoods. And we ended up it was going to be like this whole tour of the West Coast. And then I can't remember where we were going to fly out of, but we had to fly out like a day early. And we flew out of Bend. And all I remember is being in massive pain to get back to my dentist, but also that I really thought Bend, Oregon was a gorgeous part of the world. So good for you. And we'll get to your past years on the Chesapeake and stuff and your migration there. But what I don't know, Walt, is because you and I have crossed paths as biologists, we've kind of known each other for years. I put this at the beginning of the script. I'm guessing with your mind like a trap that you know where we met, but I think it might go all the way back to like Scott Petrie days at Long Point when you were like over on the Atlantic Flyway, possibly when I was the waterfall biologist with Maine. But we've been regularly seeing ourselves in the past few years at the Wingby or Parts Collection Survey for the Atlantic Flyway, where we're collecting some stable isotope kind of samples from feathers. But do you have a recollection of when we crossed paths? Or
I have a very vivid memory of when we crossed paths, and you were absolutely correct. I was touring Southwest Ontario with Bruce Pollard. Mm-hmm. Because at the time when I worked for South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, we were looking at the origins of mallards that wintered in South Carolina, and a lot of them came out of Southwest Ontario. So Bruce was kind enough to tour me around and introduce me to several people like yourself and Scott. We actually spent the night at Scott's house, and I met you out at Long Point. And I think that was, I'd have to look up when it was preceding the Great Lakes Waterfowl Symposium. So it would have been like 02, 03, somewhere in there is my guess.
Yeah, and did you give a talk on band recoveries for South Carolina then? Yeah, I remember that fondly. And a lot of those came out of Michigan for that part of the world too, didn't they? Or not?
Michigan, Southwest Ontario, the Great Lakes. And I remember talking to Dave Lukanen at the time, and he's like, I know where all your mallards are. They're in our freezer. So, but
very good. I appreciate that because I just, and there's some people who have minds like a trap, and then others like me that just kind of float through life and just keep making it up as they go along and gathering on little bits of it in the past. But whenever I've talked with you, and what I appreciate about you, Walt, is that you've got that like capacity to kind of remember all those faces and places that you've been through, which are a lot, honestly.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I particularly in my current position and places that I travel and whatnot for work, I'm very interested in meeting people. I always feel like everybody has a story and I want to hear it. And I'm just fascinated by that. And, particularly when you get into the waterfowl world, a lot of us we're connected. And like you and I followed your career and whatnot, see your name pop up in the literature. And then here we are, 20 years later, reconnecting. And to me, it's really cool.
Well, and that's like when we show up at the Wingby and then we all go out to dinner afterwards. And that is a lot of work. I tell you, when you sit there for the hours that you do and stare at blue wing, teal wings, and mallard wings and green wings Green wing wings. Sorry, that sounded weird. Green wing wings. It's it is a hardcore full day. Everybody works really hard at identifying, like, if you've ever sent wings in, this is what it's about. Biologists get together and do that. And then you go out in the evening, you have dinner, you go back to your rooms, you get up in the morning bright and early, you're in the lab by 8 o'clock, and you do a full day of it again. But what's really nice is to run into people like Walt that I hadn't seen for years, and like it's just like meeting family again. It's like a great connection with a great group of people that work together for a week. You really get to know each other, and then you go your separate ways. And I'm guessing, Walt, I'll see you again this spring down in Patuxent. We're coming back for more samples. So, but I really do want to get into the ShotSweeper because we've already tried it out here. We got one from you. We've tried it out. Had to say I was a little skeptical about how the dang thing works, but we used it with some friends the other night. We recorded and I gave a little snippet to the listeners here of the kitchen conversation episode with these guys from the Merg squad, and they were, really impressed with it. So we'll hear a little bit about it from you today, how the ShotSweeper works, and then you can get some real life, action from the Merg squad on the kitchen conversations. So this one's not going to be explicit. We're not going to drop F-bombs here. So just for the kids out there, be careful about the kitchen conversation episode. It got a little rowdy at the Merg squad bar there. But anyhow, I really do want to dig into kind of, Walt, what makes you tick. So each year's different. How's your duck season been?
Well, it's been interesting. I'm not going to say it's a bad one because, any chance we have to be in the marsh, I relish. I've shared the marsh with some good friends already this season, and, I value that. As far as the strap is concerned, it's probably been the lightest that it's been since I've been in Oregon. And as you well know, watching the weather, we've been extremely mild in the Pacific Northwest. And, at first early on, I thought maybe, things were maybe still a little north and hadn't come through yet. But, our sort of, when you get into that peak migration time of late October, first couple of weeks in November, we were out there and we just, in all honesty, just didn't see a lot. And, we killed a few birds, had fun. And, so I'm not gonna ever say it was a bad season.
Right.
We're still mild. I mean, I'm talking to you today, and I think it's almost 60 degrees. Normally, by this time, on what's called the dry side, we differentiate what side of the Cascades you're on. Normally, we're pretty frozen up by now. Snowpack, last time I looked, was like 15% of normal. There's no ice around to speak of. Like I said, it's been mild. It's supposed to be mild as far out as the public long-term forecast goes. I'm going to go hopefully tomorrow and just see what it looks like, and maybe get a bird or two. But it's been extremely mild. It was interesting last week. I'm a big skier, and I looked at Jay Peak in Vermont. At the time, they had something like 120 inches of snow already. And on Mount Bachelor, our ski hill, just right here by the house, we had 26, I think is what it was.
Wow.
And,
wow.
We're normally pretty close to opening if we haven't already opened by then. So it's been mild, and, I'm hoping there's still some birds around. Obviously, some have pushed through, but even the majority of the people that I've spoken to, I've heard more people struggling than I have heard of people doing well.
That's interesting because our early forecasts for y'all were pretty good. And this is the thing we'll talk about later. Like the weather severity index largely works really good east of the Rockies. It's well tested. And I always ask people to, from the West to tell me, how's it working? And we do get good reports, right, from folks of like, hey, you missed that one or you got that one. But like Alaska seemed to lock up fairly quick this year. British Columbia, Alberta, specifically Alberta got cold earlier than the last few years. And it really looked like stuff should be, kind of pushing to y'all. But now recently it got really, really warm, I think, in general. But like what you're saying is that even early on in season, you really weren't picking up a lot. And when you say birds, like, widgeons, birds, teal, mallards, like which species are we talking about, Walt, mostly?
Well, having been an Atlantic flyway guy the majority of my life and then moving out here in 2013, it was very interesting because I tell people, on some days depending on what's around and what's moving, I mean, you can shoot 6 or 7 different species depending on how picky you are, and the other thing I should say too is I'm purely a public land hunter. I'm not in a lease anywhere. And I've pretty much exclusively hunted on this side of the Cascades, although I have some standing invites to go to the Columbia and whatnot, and hope to do that soon. But early on, it was just I don't hunt the first weekend typically. I just let people get it out of their system because I am a public land hunter.
Yeah.
And, I typically go later in the morning, that sort of thing. Try to walk farther than the next guy. But just, I don't know how much of it was necessarily habitat related where I was hunting, but it just, regardless, we just didn't see a whole lot of birds in general. And the other thing too, I will add, being on the dry side is, I hunt a lot of sunny bluebird days, not necessarily calm, but this year it has been relatively calm when I have been hunting. So I don't know, if those combination of things have conspired to produce the results that I saw when I was out there. But, I've that said, in the past, I've killed plenty of ducks on bright sunny days wearing a t-shirt in this part of the world.
Do you think that, where you're at, as far west as you are, kind of low mid-continent populations are impacting you right now? Or is your stuff more kind of in Alaska, Western Boreal Forest? I mean, Western prairies have been dry too, which must affect you a little bit. But do you think some of that's going on? Or do you think it's, I guess that's the question. Do you think it's like a population level thing to some extent?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question because talking to some other people around the country, that has come up. Like, are we not seeing the ducks just because maybe, they're not moving, or are they just not there? Now, obviously, the Pacific Flyway benefits greatly from Alaska, and
right. And that's more stable.
Right. That's more stable. That said, we do know from banding data, birds coming out of Alberta, for example, move southwest, stage on the Snake and those places before moving this direction. You also, you have a lot of production out of the Intermountain West in general. Now, we had some drought problems for the last couple of years, although more recently, like last year, it was better. But as you well know, there's a lag time between all that as far as production catching up when it has been down. So, I'm sure like anything we deal with, there's probably multiple factors that are conspiring, but I have started to wonder if, maybe that's where we are relative to several years ago, that maybe there's just not as many birds in the system, if you will.
And that's kind of where I was trying to wonder about us this year too, because we were so dry and then we got so cold and like we just didn't have the wads of birds we usually have. I think a lot of them overflew us, but like there's some folks throwing their hands up, like Virginia right now. It's like, we don't have birds, but we've heard they're in North Carolina. Did they all go over like the DC, Virginia, kind of lower Chesapeake and down into that Virginia Shore area? And I'm like, hey, there's things on the podcast we can do with the weather severity index, and there's things we can't. But there's a lot of reports of just like, we just didn't have birds this year. And I think there's like this combination of drought and weather and low population. And I think for some people, just the stars aligned for it to be kind of one of the worst seasons ever so far. But like, West Richland, which is where Barker Ranch is, which we did an interview with the manager there at Barker Ranch about a month ago, I think, on the podcast. Like their weather severity index is nowhere near what would take to push mallards out, and just pintails barely a few times. So you got places north of you that are still, not looking great for making birds come further south too. So it's probably a combination of stuff. And everybody always wants me to come up with a silver bullet. I get like tons of Facebook Messenger and emails and texts from people like when they know my number and stuff I've communicated with before of like, what's going on here? And I'm like, man, I don't have every answer, right? The forecast is like this really broad area, but it's good to hear what's going on in your part of the world too, too, Walt. So we'll dig a little more into later maybe how the Pacific Flyway is like a little bit of a different beast when it comes to weather and migration. But you didn't start out in the West. You started in the East. I read on your bio on the ShotSweeper page, you grew up on an island in Chesapeake Bay. That seems like you're just doomed to be a waterfall biologist the rest of your life. So give a shout about the years growing up and, you know, how I get those formative years and how that shaped you as a person and as a duck hunter.
Sure. You know, I don't trade my time at all growing up. It was, you know, and I think a lot of people, you know, no matter their age, they, you know, think about where they grew up and they relish it. But I was truly blessed, I believe. I did grow up on an island in the Chesapeake Bay. It's called Kent Island. It does not look anything like it did 50 years ago when I was growing up. I'll be 61 next month. But you know, it obviously was a waterfowl rich area. And probably my earliest memories, Mike, there's two that I think about. And one of them, you know, I'd be lying in bed at night in the wintertime, fall in the winter, early spring, until things started moving out in March. And I was serenaded by Canada geese roosting in the creek next to us. And, you know, I have great memories of falling asleep, you know, to that sound and waking up to that sound. You know, and I cherish those memories. The second one was that I went on my first waterfowl hunt. I didn't have a gun. And it would have been around December. I had to look this up. It would have been December of 73 or January of 74, somewhere right there. My neighbor, and I say neighbor, this was probably lived 2 miles away from me, but he was a waterfowl outfitter and, you know, ran a goose hunting operation. You know, goose hunting was the thing back then. Mm-hmm. And I remember going and I remember riding in the cab of the truck in the dark, early morning, and we were looking for the Comet Kahutek. And I still remember that. And I had to look it up to put when the year was, but that was the first goose hunt. We hunted in a pit. I don't remember where. I don't remember other than Mr. Tryon and my dad. My dad was not carrying a gun, which I can get into in a second. But I remember my job was, if there was a wounded goose, I was to get out of the pit, and I had this short, heavy wood dowel. I don't know how round it was. But my job, and Mr. Ned told me, you don't run after him, just walk at a steady pace and dispatch him by hitting him in the head, you know, and I did that once or twice that day. I don't remember how many times, but I can still feel the vibration today in my hand. It felt just like I was when I was a little league baseball player hitting a baseball with a baseball bat, you know, and those are my two earliest memories of growing up probably on the bay. Now, obviously living on an island, even though we had roads, a bridge on each side, you know, I grew up in the marsh in a boat. It didn't matter what time of year it was. I was out there. And I just, you know, I love being in the marsh. And I will say that my parents were very supportive of me growing up. Again, my dad was not a hunter, but both my mom and dad supported my passion for it. And that's from my mom, you know, tolerating dead things in the kitchen sink, to my dad when he was able coming and checking my muskrat traps with me, for example. They supported me all the way up through my professional career. And you know, so in a sense, they weren't hunting mentors, but they were supportive and mentors in a different form. Now, that said, I did have mentors growing up, and one of them was the husband of a woman my mom worked with. And now we're talking, I'm in middle school at this point. He was a waterman and, you know, oystered in the winter and crab potted in the summer, that sort of thing. He was also a trapper, and you know, he taught me a lot of things, you know, showing me how to set muskrat traps. I actually killed my first deer with him at his cabin up in the mountains of West Virginia when I was 15. And his name was Ron Lauber, as a decoy carver as well. And, you know, I learned a lot from him. And I worked on his crab boat in the summertime, starting at age 14. And, 7 days a week, all summer, unless the weather was bad. And of course, we're out there, it's summer, but we're still talking ducks, geese, whatever, looking at things, just discussing everything waterfowl. And then, even in the winter, I'd go out sometimes when they were oystering, and I can still remember longtails flying by the stern of the boat. In fact, a longtail is the first duck I ever shot, believe it or not.
Yeah, and most people can't say that.
Yeah, and so I had Ron, and then that continued, and then of course some of my friends hunted, and we shared a goose blind together if some of them lived on the water or had a goose pit somewhere, and then ultimately probably my big, not to say big break, but a break for me was, well, I should back up. I should say I kind of knew that I really liked waterfowl when I was at football practice in high school in the fall, and this would have been 79, the fall of 79 when I was a freshman. And then rather than paying attention to what was going on the field, got my head looking at Canada geese flying over. And I quickly realized that I'd rather be in the goose pit or the deer stand or something like that than on the football field. And so that, the interest continued. And then when I was a senior in high school, I was very fortunate to, in the fall of 82, September of 82, I got to help out with this outdoor ed program for middle schoolers. And I was paired with this guy named Josh Sant from Maryland DNR. And, we taught the kids, different things about feathers and took them through hikes in the woods and stuff. And I got to do that for a week. Well, as part of that, a colleague of ours, now retired, was Larry Hindman.
Yep.
And Larry came over and did a rocket net demonstration. And that's when I first met Larry. And, so I had known about Larry just from growing up there and reading the news, reading the newspaper back when people did that stuff and whatnot, because this is in the heyday of Canada goose hunting and on the Eastern Shore,
And again, Larry was the waterfowl biologist for Maryland, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
And, so I was just like, wow, here I am meeting this guy. And, so that went on. But then the following summer, Josh called me and said that Larry was looking for summer employees to do a bay grass survey in the Chesapeake Bay. And basically we had two crews, two people each. One crew took the Eastern Shore, one crew took the Western Shore. And it was a survey designed to look at submerged aquatic vegetation abundance. That's how we did it back then. And it was actually set up by Vern Stotts, from the literature, black duck guy there in the Chesapeake, and Larry's predecessor. And this was a way to measure waterfowl food. So I got hired to do that, working for Larry. And,
now,
Larry,
right now, Walt, give me a sense of how old are you at this point?
that would have been 1983. So I would have been the summer of 83. I would have been 18.
So this is you haven't even gone to college yet.
No, I was starting that fall, and I got on with Maryland DNR and through Josh, and then ultimately Larry hired me, and I continued to work for Larry for five summers doing that survey. And then when I was home, ultimately once I got into college and I was home as an undergrad, I'd go down there sometimes in the winter and do some stuff for him. But they gave me, everybody in that office gave me multiple opportunities to see different things, whether it was small game work, deer work, but obviously I was interested in it all, but it was ultimately waterfowl. And so I worked with Larry, and then Josh encouraged me to apply to go to Virginia Tech, which I ultimately did. And as my undergrad in wildlife, forestry and wildlife, and again, continuing to work for Larry at that time. And then, came time for grad school. And I decided, we're often encouraged to go to other institutions to look at, to get exposure to other ways of thinking. But I had the unique opportunity to stay at Virginia Tech and work on canvasbacks on the Chesapeake Bay. And my house was in the center of my study area. So
it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I got to, work on a bird for my master's in an area where I grew up with it. So, it was just too good of an opportunity not to do. And I looked at myself and Dave Howarder were the two students on the project through Patuxent. And I looked at habitat use, and Dave looked at bioenergetics and movement. And so we did that. And,
For the students out there, I always say go someplace else, but if you do have an opportunity like this, go for it. But don't hone in on it too hard, because in a diverse world, go sow your oats per se, and go travel if you can. But if you've got an opportunity like Walt as well, I think is rare. I guess Walt for sure. That's rare, I think, in our world.
Yeah, it was totally rare and a unique opportunity. And again, that's the only reason I took it. I was fully prepared to go somewhere else at the time of graduation. But it was awesome to be able to do that. And then, bounced around from a job or two here and there, and then ultimately settled in South Carolina, of all things, the head of the alligator program.
Yeah, I did want to get to the gator point here, so I'll just kind of leave that one there and let you tell us about how you went from ducks to gators.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, but I think it's one you'll appreciate as well, is that, having worked for Larry so long, and seen him, my goal was to be a state waterfowl biologist, much like you were for the state of Maine. That's sort of what I was focused on. So I couldn't find a job at that time in that. And so I was like, well, I'll go down here and do this alligator thing, get the experience running a species-oriented program for a state agency, and flip it around on waterfowl someday. Well, 17 years later, I was still there.
17 years?
17 years. Yeah. And so, but that said, the other draw with that was, I should add, is that it, at the time, alligators had been on the endangered species list, except for a very small area on the Texas-Louisiana border. And one of my charges when I got hired was to set up a harvest program for alligators in South Carolina. So kind of like the Canvasback project, as a wildlife biologist, having the opportunity to now design a harvest program for an animal that had been on the endangered species list, that's a pretty rare opportunity. Mm-hmm. So I jumped into it with both feet and, set up a, science-based monitoring program, which, I don't need to go into the details, but, it was a couple years of different surveys, aerial and spotlight surveys. And, ultimately we set up the harvest program, implemented it, and had a great monitoring program. And that was in addition to doing all the, nuisance stuff, which we could have a whole nother episode on alligator stories.
Just stories, right?
Yeah. And I don't, when I thought, oh God, I'm going to go be the alligator biologist, I want to be a duck biologist, but I don't, I have no misgivings about taking that program and the experience I got doing it. And what ultimately happened is that nobody in South Carolina could fly midwinter surveys when we were doing those because they got airsick. Mm-hmm. I had done my master's program had a large aerial component in it of tracking the canvasbacks. And so I could fly and didn't get sick. And the wintertime, obviously my alligator work slowed down. So Tommy Strange, who was the state waterfowl biologist, asked me to, if I wanted to be the observer. And I did. And so I started doing that. And I was flying with a person who did what I do now. He's since retired, Carl Ferguson. In the first couple of years, I kind of sat there with my, hands under my legs and looked out the window and counted ducks. And, and over time, I'd start asking Carl, like, what does this do? What does this do? And a lot of that was out of self-preservation in case something happened to him. I wanted to be able to get the airplane on the ground. And I ended up flying with Carl for 14 years.
Wow.
And 14 winters. And, he's the one that recruited me into the position where I am today.
Yeah, and when I was in Maine for 3 years, so I'd flown on the Great Lakes with Petrie at Long Point and stuff like that. But then I flew the midwinter survey, and in fact, during the summer, Dan McCulley, Brad Allen, names you'll recognize, took me up in the plane to go fly around, look for black ducks in like June or whatever. It was grossly hot, and they're like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm good flying in a plane in the cold." But they were like, "Well, he didn't puke, but it was pretty close." But I'd never even gotten close until flying in a hot, humid plane in the summer was completely different. But then after my, I think I flew 3 midwinter surveys, and then I was going to have to go for training so that I could not anything major, not fly the plane really, but land it if I had to, right? Like what you're saying is that it's just good for the observer to be able to have that expertise as well in case something happens to the pilot. And then I just happened to move on. But I tell you, there's a lot of people that like get out of the plane for the last time and they're like, "Yep, I'm done." That low level flying is exhausting. It's hard work. And so let's dive into that, your kind of pilot biologist life with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I don't want to blur the lines here because ShotSweeper is definitely an entirely separate, thing from your day job. But just a bit for listeners of kind of what it means to be a pilot biologist with Fish and Wildlife Service, like and then continue with that thread you were on of jumping from, doing some of that observation of the plane to being the guy that's actually, flying and working for the service.
Sure. Oh, well, it's being a pilot biologist, obviously, as you well know, it's a very, again, seem to keep falling into these unique positions. And it is. And, I don't take it for granted every day because, the stuff that we get to see is it's incredible across this continent, and I've been fortunate to fly from the high Arctic all the way down to, into Mexico, both in the left seat and then some early on in the right seat being an observer. So if you're a waterfowl biologist, it's a very unique opportunity to see the landscape of this country, the other duties associated with the job, from running banding crews to the wing bee, just being able to see birds, just be exposed to waterfowl, whether there's wings, whether they're live birds during preseason banding, whether they're looking at birds out the window during the breeding season when they're in pairs or small groups versus, the magnificent flocks of wintering birds. It's just a spectacle, no matter the number of birds you're seeing out the window, that it's a unique privilege and one that I do not take for granted by any means, and certainly look forward to every time we get up in the airplane. And, ultimately, at the end of the day, they are just ducks, and we're not going to push it by any means from a weather standpoint. We're offered great training, good equipment, and, the first goal every day is get home safely and collect some data secondarily at the end of it to, help monitor and conserve this great resource that we all enjoy.
Yeah, there's definitely that hazard portion of it. And I have not seen a tenth of what you've seen probably, but flying the Great Lakes, flying the coast of Maine, the best seat to the scenery of the coast of Maine is in a plane flying 200 feet off the deck. And when they say you can't get there from here, that's a Maine thing, right? You can't get there from here because you're sitting on one shore and you're looking at a house on the other side because you got to drive 40 miles north and then back down because they're like these long fingers. Right. But now imagine flying a plane up and down those things. So if you can imagine like that cancer ribbon where it kind of just does the loop and then back down that people pin on their shirts, I think. That's kind of how you go in one side and you turn and you loop up and you come back down. And half the time when I'm the observer, the plane's on its side and I'm just flying sideways down this narrow piece of water. And then the ledges where the eiders and scoters sit offshore I mean, my pilot would just do figure eights with me on my side looking straight down at him. It's cool. I mean, but it's exhausting on your body too. You surprisingly use muscles in that plane. Maybe it's like you don't get car sick when you drive. I don't know if it's easier as a pilot, but as an observer, I was beat up by the end of the day on those surveys.
Oh yeah, yeah, and sure, it's the same thing probably from the left seat. I will. You've probably been there, and I think other people that are listening that have been observers, that here, I was so happy when I moved to the left seat from the right seat, because when I had to go to the bathroom, I could stop anytime I wanted to after, I made that decision as opposed to being in the right seat, but like, when are we stopping? When's the next airport and all that stuff? But yeah, it mentally and physically, staring out the window, and, good observers are, they're not a dime a dozen. It takes a real skill, and it starts with intestinal fortitude for sure.
Yeah, and you just don't jump off a cliff on that one. I mean, it took me years of flying on the Great Lakes to then, it helped me get that job in Maine, I think, right? Because I could actually ID all those black and white birds that were out there to a large degree on the ocean and in those bays. I don't know, mergansers and goldeneyes are still not great, but.
Oh, that's a tough one for sure.
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
All right, moving on. What was the aha moment with the ShotSweeper, right? Like, how did this kind of, magnets to detect non-toxic shot and meat come along? Where was that?
Well, so when I moved to Oregon, and actually the year before I moved, I started going to the Pacific Flyway Wing B, in anticipation of moving out here. And one of the things we do on a Wednesday is have a duck burn. And Norm Sakey, retired state waterfowl biologist from Nevada, and Greg Gerstenberg, he's now a retired wildlife biologist from California Game and Fish. They would team up on Wednesdays, bring ducks, like 50 ducks or so of all different species, and swans. And over the years, there's been a nutria or two in there. And they would cook them. And Norm was the cook, and Greg would help him. And, I was new out there, so I'm just sort of, sitting back. I mean, obviously I knew some people already, just because, as you well know, our field's small, and, if you don't know the person specifically, you know of them, but I was kind of just hanging back watching, and I kept seeing Greg over there after Norm would pull a duck off and would cut it on the cutting board. I'd see Greg, and this is a pretty good distance away, much longer than a bow shot from a deer stand on a deer. And I could see his right arm moving, over the ducks, but I couldn't tell what he was doing. I thought maybe he's sprinkling some seasoning or something. I didn't know. I just kept watching him, and I finally walked over there and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he was holding his hand with all of his fingers together in this awkward position, and he flipped it over and he said, "I have a magnet. I'm looking for steel shot." Now, at the time, I had a crown in my head from like 1993 from biting on a piece of steel shot. And I admire dentists for their skills and stuff, but I hate going to the dentist. And when I saw that, I was like, does that really work? And there's pellets stuck to this magnet. He's like, yeah, here, try it. So, duck comes off the grill, and Norm cuts it up, and I'm running it over it. And I'm like, holy crap, look at this, And it was like an aha moment, right? Because I didn't want to be in the dentist chair again.
I've got three. I've been to the dentist at least 3 times for a shot, and I'm pretty sure our listeners are like, "Yep, been there."
Right? Yeah, we've all been there. If you hunt ducks or whatever, and and even now steel shots required for other birds and game birds in some states. But it at that point, not that we just every year I'd come back, and Greg would have his magnet, and I didn't really put 2 and 2 together, other than I knew I wanted to get a magnet at some point. Didn't know what size magnet or anything, but we just kept doing this over the years, and that would have been like 2012, the first time I was exposed to that. And of course, it makes sense, right? A magnet, but again, you don't know how strong a magnet or anything like that. And so it went on, and then about 2017 or 18, here in Bend, we have a thing that's called the DIY Cave, and it's a makerspace. And for your listeners that don't necessarily know what a makerspace is, I describe it as it's like a health club with tools. And ours is pretty awesome. You know, it's got a full metal shop with all the welding equipment you want. It's got a tech room with 3D printers, jewelry studio, a full wood shop with every piece of wood equipment, you could think of. It's just an awesome place to go. And it's a community of makers, and it's very supportive. And what I always wanted to do is I wanted to learn to weld, So these guys were at one of our festivals here in Bend, and I introduced myself and said, I'd like to learn to weld. And they're like, well, you need to talk to this guy, and yada yada yada. Well, all that said, in the back of my mind, I've always wanted to bring if you will, a widget to market. I've always had that burning opportunity. I respect entrepreneurs and small business owners that are out there hustling every day, and when I used to outdoor write, ultimately, a book or two was going to be that widget, and it still may be in the future here when I get some more time. But, I always had that desire. And so the first thing I was thinking about was this tool for in skiing. And so I took a course at the Cave, we call it the Cave, on 3D printing. Now, at the time, 3D printing was in its infancy and wasn't, where the technology, like anything, hadn't progressed to where it is today. But the big thing was I learned how to model. And, I was working, because the first prototype for my thing for the ski industry actually made out of wood, because wood is what I knew. But then I took this course. I sort of put the welding desire on hold. And I took this course, and I watched YouTube and learned how to model and whatnot. And so I did that, and I got pretty good at it. And so one day I got thinking about this with picturing my hand and Greg's hand holding that magnet, how awkward it looked. And I thought, I'm going to develop a handle for a magnet, right? And so I started playing around with different designs, modeling. Now, the other thing, we didn't know the strength of the magnet that Greg had. It came out of a rechargeable flashlight that you shake to charge it. Mm-hmm. So I had no idea. So I texted Greg, and then this would have been, it may have been prior to COVID. It may have been that far back. I said, hey, you're going to get a package. Keep it away from your pacemaker. He didn't have a pacemaker, but he knew what I meant, because I was just fascinated with this, because I didn't want to bite on a piece of steel shot. And so what I did was I bought 3 different size magnets, and I said, here's what I want to do. I went at it scientifically, like any problem you and I, when we're thinking. I said, scan a piece of duck meat from smallest to largest with the magnets, and I'd modeled up a handle and glued them in there and stuff like that. And then scan it with your magnet to see if it finds any shot that one of the previous 3 didn't. And ultimately, we were able to home in on what was a good size. And, I got that part figured out, and then I printed up a few more handles. Well, then, I was looking at injection molding for plastic, just toying with this off and on over the years. Well, it was $16,000 to get a mold, the injection mold, the handle to made with the magnet. Yeah, it's kind of like, wow, that's kind of expensive. So I kind of, just, fiddled with it. I had some prototypes. I'd use them for myself every season. Greg had one. I sent one to another friend of mine. And, and everybody's like, you got to sell these things. This is awesome, And so I was getting really close. And one of the things, again, sort of like looking at the size magnet that we needed that worked, I looked at handle designs, and I had done different handle designs and watched or got feedback from people on which handle they liked. And I just wasn't, and I honed in on something, but I just wasn't comfortable with it. So like anything, I sort of did a literature research, search, if you will. And I found this dissertation. It was 450 pages long on redesigning a handle for a scalpel. And because a handle for a scalpel's never been redesigned. It's, this is laterally compressed handle with a sharp blade in it. Looks like a bluegill, with a sharp blade on the end. And these people did all kinds of stuff, accelerometers on it, observed surgeons, and they made all these recommendations. I read the whole daggone document and took those recommendations and incorporated them into a different handle. And, again, 3D print some prototypes, play around with it, just myself, off and on, maybe send one down to Greg. And I was just, kind of toying with it. And then I was over at the cave 2 years ago, I think it was, a Christmas party. And this one guy there that didn't hunt, and these people were aware of sort of what I was doing at the time. Again, this is stretched over many years. And this one gentleman, he's like, "Hey, where are you with that magnet thing?" And he didn't hunt. He wasn't a hunter. And I said, "Yeah, I need to get on that. I mean, I got a full-time job, and family and stuff. You only have so much time in the day."
Right.
So that Christmas, I started just digging into it. And I took that handle design. I sort of caught back up with the 3D printing technology of where it was. And people had started optimizing designs for 3D printing to mass produce stuff, just say widgets, if you will. And so I then took those recommendations and incorporated them into the handle that I liked and ultimately made the product that we have today. And again, people were encouraging me and I kept going on, and I finally just, picking away at it, eating the elephant one bite at a time, just like, okay, and ultimately got to where it was time to launch it. And so we launched it just under a month ago.
So a little on on a day, like when you're using it, right? Like what is, and I've got some firsthand stuff I'll share when you're done that, from trying it out myself, but I don't think I probably have it down as well as you do. Like, what is the exact technique? Because I'm thinking like a thick, mallard breast and stuff and a pellet's in the middle of it, like when it's on the side, fine or whatever. But what is the technique to detect the shot that you would use with the ShotSweeper?
Well, and there's two things to answer that question to start. The first thing I would say is I'll never claim that this will find 100% of the pellets. I would never claim that. What I will tell people is it might find the one that you bite and break your tooth. Now, that said, we've had very good luck finding all the pellets in many cases, but there has been an instance or two where I've missed one, or it's missed one. So that's the first thing, and I tell people that. The second thing is I tell people to go slow. A lot of people get it, and I know we're recording this and nobody can see it, but they wave it over the piece of meat or the carcass very quickly. Just go slow. Just take your time. Like I tell people, if you don't have time to do things right the first time, how are you going to have time to do it over? So just go slow. Those are the two biggest things. Now, what I personally do is, so I shoot some birds. I come home, I may hang them for a couple of days or two, depending on my schedule. And then when I after I clean them, whether I pluck them, whether I breast them, cut the legs off, whatever, when I get ready to wash them in the sink, I run the ShotSweeper over it. Okay. Try to find things. I then, may put the birds in the freezer. Some I may eat that night, who knows? But when I pull the birds back out, I do run it again over it. And then when I cook them, depending on how I cook them, whether I'm grilling a whole carcass, whether I'm making, say, barbacoa out of legs or something like that, once I take the meat out and say for barbacoa for the legs, you're going to shred that on a cutting board. I'll shred all that meat, get the bones out, discard the bones, and then that shredded pile of meat I'll spread out on the cutting board, and I run the ShotSweeper over it to still see if I find anything before putting it back in, with all the juices. A duck breast, same thing. I pull it out, have it on the cutting board before I give it to my wife and daughter, for example. I'll run it over it. But I also keep one at the table. So with a duck breast, for example, or a goose breast, and it'll detect it even when it's on the other side, if you haven't cut it. But even when, you cut the duck breast across the grain, you got it on your plate, I'll have a ShotSweeper sitting on the table and I'll run it over it. And, I feel fairly confident at that point that I found everything that's going to be there. But honestly, Mike, I just don't want to end up in the dentist chair. So I'm extremely cautious.
And that's a good call. And when they're in those little strips, what I noticed is the meat moves. If there's a
Yep.
pellet, if you're cutting them half-inch thick, maybe you even cut them thinner, right? That piece of meat will move. It might, if cooked, it might be like sealed in there, right? But it's going to tell you there's a pellet. And you're probably then going to see a little bit of a hole there too. The other thing that I did, and I think our listeners are going to run into this a lot, is like, and I'm bad. This is my thing. Like, I was watching the Bills game the other day, hanging out with neighbors, drinking a beer, and we had a whole bunch of roast duck out there cutting bits, and I'm chewing away like a mad mother effer. And I hit a tooth pretty bad. I didn't chip anything, right? But then I knew that pellet was in there, but I couldn't quite find where it was at, right? So it's really easy at that point once it's chewed too. And this might sound gross to some folks, but like, and you've done this, like feel around, and all of a sudden the pellet just disappeared in the meat again. Just put it on the plate and put the ShotSweeper over it, and it sucked it right out. The other thing I did that I told Walt about, and it's on the Merg Squad episode, which I would recommend people not to do because you might have metal in your face, is I literally had chewed around on one. I hadn't run the ShotSweeper over yet, but I had it with me. I had showed the guys a demonstration, and I put it up like right against my lips. I just pursed my lips with a piece of meat, and it sucked the piece of shot right out of my mouth. So this is probably something Walt will have to put a disclaimer on the ShotSweeper now, but. And I even have implants. I've got, the tooth thing I just talked about. I have an implant on one of my front middle teeth from, that's either bar fights or baseball or football or something like that over the years. But it did pull that piece of steel shot straight out, like from right around the end of my tongue onto the ShotSweeper. So there's, I think, and to me, one thing too, Walt, is that, be patient with it, as you said, don't have to do it again. But it adds a whole nother dimension to making the meal a fun process as well as safer, definitely from the dentist standpoint.
Yeah. And I agree. I enjoy eating ducks of all species, and whether that's eiders that I've shot up in your old part of the world in Maine, to even shovelers out here, or a beautiful green-winged teal, or a nice white fat pintail. I want to enjoy that meal. And while I still do scan it after it's cooked and maybe when it's at the table, and I still kind of like you, I try to remember not to close my mouth all the way when I'm chewing, just for that reason. But we're humans, we make mistakes, and just like you did. And we're in the probability game as researchers, and I just want to help people reduce the probability of, breaking a tooth. And it's not this isn't, I'm not solving world hunger or curing cancer with this. It's meshing of a magnet with what I feel is an ergonomic handle, just to make things easier for people. The other thing is, we did the research to try to balance what strength magnet works the best while balancing cost, because you can get an extremely strong magnet that's extremely dangerous. And believe me, I've had some hiccups just fooling with the magnets I'm dealing with, but the cost would be, pretty prohibitive. Still cheaper than the dentist bill, but prohibitive from, if you wanted to sell it. And, so it's that balance. And then the other thing I will add, and you well know this, and, even if you're shooting some of the other shot that doesn't have a high amount of iron in it, which is what the magnet's detecting, obviously, remember, a large percentage of the birds out there are carrying pellets. And the guy the season before me, or the blind next to me, may have shot a duck that's got a carried pellet in it. And I think, oh, I'm shooting this shot, I don't need that tool. But a large percentage. And then, I was doing some research on that just to refresh my mind. And there's actually Matt Perry on Canvasbacks, when they were scanning them for carried pellets, they actually had a live bird that had 9 pellets in it back in the 70s or 80s.
I've heard something like 25% of mallards in Louisiana, if they ever make it there, are carrying pellets around. Like, that's insane, right?
Right.
These birds get shot at a lot. So, I think that's a high end of it for sure. but it's still there now. So we tried it on lead shot, doesn't work on lead shot, right?
Correct.
And then is there non-toxic it doesn't work on, just so the folks know? I mean, I think it's like tungstens might be about it, or
Yeah, even I think the tungsten, I'd have to go back and refresh my memory. I did look that up, and I have that on the research under the FAQs, or I mean, I have it on the website under the FAQs. But even something like, and I don't shoot anything but exclusively steel shot. But I did have some TSS shells that somebody gave me. It did stick to the magnet.
okay.
Because I think there is, those are a blend of tungsten powder and some iron in that, different alloys. But even like heavy shots, a combination of different.
What about bismuth?
I don't have any bismuth, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I probably should have looked that up.
It's anything with iron, though, is what it's detecting, right?
Yeah, anything that's iron. And so the way I go at it is I just treat every duck that I shoot, whether I shot it. I mean, obviously I shot it, but I just assume that I want to make sure there's nothing in there that's going to break my teeth.
Yeah, that's fair. So I guess how do folks, find ShotSweeper to order? I think this is a great Christmas present idea at this point, right? For our duck hunting friends, get it for your buddies. I don't know, get it for your wife if she's the one that's doing the cooking of your birds, or vice versa. I gotta keep it PC here as well. So for my wife also duck hunts, and we both cook back and forth once in a while. So how do folks find your ShotSweeper now, Walt?
Well, they can go to the internet and just Google ShotSweeper, or go www.shotsweeper.com. I don't have the social media stuff going quite yet, since we just launched this about 3 weeks ago. But they can get to the website, and right now I ran a sale over Black Friday and Cyber Monday. I'm running a sale right now. I'm calling it mid-season because it's mostly mid-season for the vast majority of the country, even though it's Christmas time. But if they put in the discount code, mid-season at checkout, they get 10% off. Also, if you order 2 or more ShotSweepers, you get 10% off those products. There is some swag on the website if you want a sweatshirt or something, or a sticker. But what I would like to offer to the Foul Weather listeners is exclusive to them, since they're the only ones going to hear this. If they also, after they put in, if they want to take advantage of the 10% for the mid-season code, after that loads, just go back to the discount code on the website at checkout and type in Foul Weather with a capital F and a capital W, just like your logo, and they'll get another 10% off. So wow. Exclusive to them. So minimum of 20% if you order 1, but if you order 2 or more, you get that extra 10% from the quantity. But yeah, I'm going to extend that to your listeners.
That's awesome. And this is organic because you sprung this on me too. So really appreciate that, Walt. And they come in the regular size and then the mega size. And then they've got some different color handles. So there's that blaze orange. There's a green, like a greenhead. There's a blue, like a mallard speculum, and a black, like the black on a bluebill. I got the orange one because I lose shit. So if you can give me something and have me drop it in the marsh or make it disappear in the kitchen, it's kind of what I do. So I got the one with a nice blaze orange handle. But good stuff, Walt. Really appreciate it.
5 different colors, and I
must have missed one then, I guess.
Well, you're right. There's the blaze orange. There's the red that's I call 12 gauge red, even though I shoot a 28 gauge, and those are red shells. I named it 12 gauge. Yeah. And then there's the mallard speculum blue, and then the green. That's the deep green, like on a nice, beautiful drake ringneck. You see that green on their wings, and then diver black is what I call it. And yes, there is 2 different sizes. There's the original, which is what we started, and then an XL, which is 45% stronger than the original one. Obviously a little bit more expensive since it's a thicker magnet. And I will tell people is, when you go to the website, watch the videos, because no matter how much you try, you're going to get something inadvertently stuck to it, or you're going to stick it inadvertently, and you got to know how to dislodge it. So just be careful. And
yeah, don't put it near your computer and stuff like that, because like I got one of these metal racks with all my hunting stuff on it, and it was in a box, and I went to grab it to go use it the other day and tried to walk out of the office, and it sucked my hand to the metal rack.
Yeah.
But Hey, just a little bit. Let's get back duck-wise though, because I feel like the Pacific Flyway is a different beast when it comes to weather. I mean, the winds aren't just due north-south like they are central. I mean, they're not due north-south, but there's like the winds just swirl out there. The coast is just really mild the whole winter long. It's not really a north-south migration. So, kind of like some tips for folks watching the weather in the West beyond what we give on the Foul Weather podcast. What do you got, Walt?
Sure. First off, I'll say, I'm always learning. I'm not, no matter where I'm hunting, and I've only been out here since 13, so I'm no means an expert relative to some other people I know. But when you look at this flyway, outside of Alaska, particularly when you get down into the lower 48, I mean, it's very diverse. Again, just even here in Oregon, where I am, being on the dry side versus the wet side over in the Willamette Valley, I tend to be colder than over there. You have that, and then you have the big Columbia River flowing through this that doesn't freeze, and you have habitats off of that, like you alluded to with Barker Ranch, and then you have the lower Columbia, down by Portland and on out to the ocean, and all those are duck habitat, and then you get into California, and Sac Valley, Central Valley, rice country, all of that stuff. It's very diverse. And so what I do just personally, I fortunately, being exposed to research and stuff and whatnot, I have an idea when ducks are moving through, and, I target my hunting, around those times, like I alluded to earlier, particularly since I'm a public lands hunter. But, I know I haven't hunted in California, but, those guys down there really like, get the fog and a low fog that keeps the birds low. So it's really diverse. I mean, obviously, go when you can, because none of us are guaranteed it tomorrow, obviously. And you might go today and it'd be crappy, and you go tomorrow and it may be the same weather, and, you have a fantastic hunt.
So rain events like that thing that's coming on the up and over the Pacific Northwest, what does that do to the kind of the duck move? Does it really disperse them on the landscape into wet fields, things like that? Like, what does that, I mean, you're in the dry side of it, right? But like the wet on the other side must make, and into California when that happens, must make things go sideways, a lot of local movement.
Yeah, and that's, I here again, I'm relying on a lot of information from people that are in those areas, since I haven't experienced. So yeah, we're having an atmospheric river. We've had it for the last couple of days. It's to the north of me. It's sort of coming in across the Northwest, Oregon and into Washington mostly. But yeah, I'm sort of an outlier being on the dry side, because we're, being in the desert, you're looking for water and you're hunting that. But certainly in those areas that get that higher rain events, you get a lot of sheet water that disperses birds and whatnot. And, again, these birds are good at finding places where they're not shot at, so despite what might look like good habitat, if it's got some pressure on it, they're gonna take advantage when it's advantageous to them to utilize it.
Some of the simplest things I tell people is you do understand that ducks aren't going to hang out where they're shot at, just to be fair. So that's why I say, you say like go when you can for sure, but maybe don't go every day all the time either, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, if we could, great. I mean, I know some people that are retired and have that time, but and they live like I have to drive 100 miles to where I hunt. So, I like I said, I try to go when I know migration's on, and certainly, I'm a weather geek. I'm a pilot, for God's sake. So I have to pay attention to the weather even when I'm not flying. So, yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll get tuned in a little bit more with the West over the years here as we refine things and, get our forecast tightened up a bit. I think we've been doing really good, really far north in the Pacific Flyway, but not as much as it heads south, because it just gets wild down there and everything. Lots of times a lot of the stuff is mild where the ducks want to be, so it's pressure, it's water, it's food, it's other things, I think, other than weather, as opposed to like the Mississippi Flyway where that cold and snow kind of pushes south, and there's a lot more of a north-south gradient, I think, in the other three flyways than the Pacific Flyway, I think, is what I'm getting at in general.
Yeah, And that's probably, and again, it's so diverse. There are areas that are farther north that a duck can still make a living all winter. The one thing we do see, like on my side, which includes the Klamath Basin, is if it's been cold, like if December is normally, the water's pretty frozen, pretty tied up, but we get a mild spell in January, we get a reverse migration. Well, birds will come back up out of the Sac Valley and be there. Now, they may only be there a short period of time because it may get cold again. Sometimes it just stays mild enough that they can just stay there until they're ready to go back in the spring. But they will move back up there. How they know, well, when you figure it out, you let me know. But
man, we got it pretty fine tuned, but we don't have it fully tuned. Let's go with that. So, hey, and I'm not really calling you old because you're only 10 years older than me, so I guess we're both old and we could both provide pieces of advice. But if you had one piece of advice across all your time, east to west, north to south, across this great continent, what would you do to make duck hunting better in some way? What would that be?
We could probably do several episodes on that, Mike. Obviously, it's probably a multi-pronged.
One thing.
Yeah, I know. And I've been fortunate to see a lot of habitat, both professionally from the air and also hunting across the country. I think the thing I would say is that everything we do, has an impact on the environment, no matter how much we try, there is an impact, and you see that, and I'm not going to call out certain activities, but there's an impact. We're all guilty of it. Now, that said, I think the birds are fairly resilient to what we've thrown at them. That said, they're not immune. And so my answer to that, short answer, if I had to pick one thing, was, we need to do everything we can to support habitat conservation and good habitat management. Just saying, you have, this 1,000-acre place protected area that's a refuge or something. If it is capable of being managed and it's not being managed to its full potential, then, it's paper acres. And I will extend that in saying, for hunters, they need to support conservation organizations that are doing habitat conservation that support wetland dependent species. Buy your duck stamp. That's probably one of the best daggone investments all of us can make. Buy two. It's money well spent. And I think ultimately, as hunters and even non-hunters that would buy a duck stamp, if we can make sure we have habitat on the ground for these birds, ultimately, that's going to translate into a good hunting experience for everybody. It's kind of a disconnect because you really don't. It's hard to see that, but ultimately, just having those pieces of puzzle across the landscape over the bird's entire annual cycle is going to ultimately benefit us as conservationists.
Yeah, and it's just been an uphill battle. I mean, we're losing wetlands, we're losing grasslands, and so. Again, they're resilient, but they're not immune. I love that. I love that comment, Walt. And so I always come back to it's one of those that's hard because it doesn't feel tangible. And I've told people like, hey, don't just go duck hunt up in the prairies. Like book a fishing trip. I mean, the pike fishing, the walleye fishing, the bass fishing, the bluegills that are the size of pie plates up there. And you can, if you got two hooks on your line, you can catch two giant bluegills at a time, right? Great things for kids. And so go up in the prairies in late May and June and, I don't know, whenever you can get your kids out of school and go see duck territory and see what it really is and look at some of those waterfowl production areas and understand where your dollars, are really going. And this stuff goes up and down the flyway and, we need to support our national wildlife refuges or wildlife management areas. And I'd say our private folks, as much as they get vilified, they're contributing a majority of the habitat out there, right? As well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah. So put your best foot forward for the habitat. I like that one, Walt. Really appreciate you being here, folks. Go see ShotSweeper for sure. And Walt, we're going to give you last word before we sign off and go do the migration forecast for the week.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me. And if anybody have any questions about the product, just reach out to me. All the contact information's there on the website. And as we turn the corner around turn 3 or whatever of the duck season, and hope everybody has good luck, and you happy holidays to everybody and yourself. And again, I appreciate you having me on, and look forward to seeing you in person in the spring.
Yes, sir. Thanks for your insights, and thanks for introducing our folks to ShotSweeper, Walt.
Thank you.
A quick follow-up here before we jump into the migration forecast for the week. Remember that code FowlWeather to get 10% off your ShotSweeper order, and this can be combined with the code midseason to get a total of 20% off your order, but you have to use those codes before January 1st when they expire. What a great deal right before Christmas. Thanks, Walt, for that opportunity for our listeners. And as noted, this thing works. Look up our ShotSweeper video on Facebook and Instagram to see it at work in our kitchen in Jack's Reef. We were grinding good breasts and legs from some goose to make some sausage, and the ShotSweeper saved some grinder blades for sure. How many days have you had empty skies over the duck blind? Your property can be more with wildlife strategies. It is no secret that hiring a consultant, an expert in managing water, woods, and fields, an expert in duck food, an expert in hunting pressure management, hiring a consultant yields better habitat for the critters you chase. Less empty skies, more quality days of field, more smiles for miles with family and friends. If that's your game and goal, contact Ryan Delaney at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. The Farmland Group is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisal across Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, and growing. Contact them today at farmlg.com. Hey, I'm telling you, do not hesitate because these folks are busy buying, selling, and providing consulting and management strategies that build value into your portfolio and your land. So get in the queue today. Get on their radar. Get on their books. Man, y'all won't be disappointed. Contact the Farmland Group today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. And here we go with the migration report for the week. It has certainly been a wild ride this year for the Central Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, but we have a bit of a lull coming midweek this week. But let's start with the Pacific Flyway because we want to get to the bad news first and get it out of the way. In general, the Pacific Flyway migration has stalled. After an early blast of cold into Alaska and Western Canada, maybe down into Montana and northern Idaho, it has really slowed up with the cold bubble being almost entirely east of the Rockies. I do think the Wednesday to Friday weather event and wind in the upper portions of the Pacific Flyway provide some opportunity to make local ducks move around and be available for harvest, but as far as any big push, it just is not in the cards this week. The high winds and some snow and rain mix is largely concentrated in Washington State and Oregon, but once you get to California, it all kind of moderates. That all said, our pick day is Friday, and specifically Friday morning at the northern end of the Pacific Flyway. But wind gusts could be up to 50 miles per hour in some locales, so be safe out there, my friends. On to the Central Flyway. Not an overly exciting one this week, with migration probably stalling early in the week as the winds shift to out of the south. Despite temperatures being relatively cold right now on Monday in the eastern half of the Central Flyway, but then we are really hit with a strong warm-up throughout most of the week with south winds and WSI values well above those needed to make ducks move in abundance. But on Wednesday and into Thursday morning, we see a slight cold shot move down through the Dakotas into Nebraska and bump a little bit into Kansas, but probably not enough other than to move some wimpy ducks south a bit more, but nothing spectacular. Our pick day, though, is either right now on Monday or Thursday because it's also a high wind day from the north. Probably enough to make ducks move locally, but again, pretty gusty, so be safe out there. On to the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways next because they've been tied together quite a bit so far this season. The Mississippi flyway's been a bit colder, with cold pushing a little bit farther south. with that line from northeast Montana to the southern border of Virginia at about a 45-degree angle. That's really where kind of the cold and snow has set up. That's kind of a very traditional La Nina signature. Mallards are hanging best they can right now at about the line, in Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, right around that kind of cold and snow line that goes from northeast Montana to that southern border of Virginia. So mallards are hanging best they can right at about that line in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, with most other dabbling ducks now being south or farther south of that kind of cold and snow line. As noted last week, we predicted that Sunday, yesterday, would be a big migration day, and we stand by that. But right after that, despite cold conditions early in the week, kind of mid-latitudes of the Midwest over to around the eastern shore of Maryland. Today and Tuesday, the winds, I guess, despite it being cold in that region, the winds are entirely wrong direction for any mass exodus of ducks to places farther south. So later in the week, though, after this early stuff early on, the cold early, temperatures really moderate, and that snow line melts back 200 to 400 miles north, depending upon where you're at in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways. That said, the Saturday night into Sunday north wind looks likely to move ducks deeper into the south than years past. So this is last Saturday night into Sunday that already just happened. And they're going to shuffle around during the week. Unfortunately, the big wind day is Thursday, which also will bring 70-degree temperatures into the deep south, likely resulting in kind of little local movements as ducks just hang close to home because they don't have any energy need to fly and feed. There is a slight north wind on Friday that some ducks are predicted to take advantage of to make small movements south, but overall, compared to prior weeks, we don't expect much movement. That said, the cold and north winds over last weekend, and specifically Sunday, had new ducks moving south into the southern Missouri to North Carolina latitude, as well as points farther south. So while the weather does moderate throughout the week, naive ducks are new. New naive ducks are out there. They should be around. So, hunting new unpressured locations is recommended throughout the week because this should yield new ducks that haven't learned where guns are and guns are not. We're also pretty darn dry east of the Rockies most of the week, other than a quick system that starts east of the Mississippi River and runs from about the state of Mississippi up through the Ohio River Valley and up to the Great Lakes. This happens Thursday, midday into the afternoon, but none of this will drop more than a half inch of rain anywhere, so not a system that really will make new flooded duck habitat or really push ducks to shuffle around much at all. Overall, if you were to take a week off and get work done, we'd suggest it this week. Some okay days, but overall a warming trend with a retreating snowline all week. Look for a reverse migration, I don't like that term, or at least local movements of ducks reshuffling at the freeze line around mid to kind of northern Missouri and Illinois. This is likely the best bet for the midweek movements, is finding high wind days with warming and reshuffling of ducks locally. Anyhow, it's kind of a bust this week for the most part, folks across duck country. As always, send us your questions and your observations. Also interested to hear about what y'all are seeing out there for ducks, duck movement, and success. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.